Hello, and welcome back to another discussion on some bioethical issues. Today we're going to talk about organ transplantation and some of the ethical issues involved in transplantation and donation. In December of 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard performed the first successful heart transplantation surgery. It wasn't the first transplantation. There had been other transplantations. Corneas, for example, had been transplanted since the 1940s. In 1954, we had the first kidney transplantation. But with the heart transplantation of 1967, it really elevated the view of transplantation in the media, and we really reached the age of transplantation science here. Today, transplantation is a fairly common surgical procedure with a fairly high successful rate. Kidney transplants, for example, succeed 90-95% of the time. Heart transplants, 75-80% of the time. Liver transplants, about 75% of the time. Lung transplants, which are the newer transplants on the block, about 55-60% success rate. By success rate, we mean people live 2 years or beyond after the transplant. While it's a common procedure, though, it's not without its problems. Along with the surgical risks involved in transplantation, there's also the problem of the immunological rejection issue. Organs are foreign tissue, just like any other foreign tissue that invades the body, like a virus or a bacteria. And our body's immunological system will tend to reject that foreign tissue. Therefore, those people who have transplants usually aren't done with just simply having the transplant. They often have to go through a lifetime of receiving some sort of immunosuppressive drugs, like cyclosporine, for example, throughout their whole life. So there's always a lot more involved medically in transplants than just simply the transplant itself. There are also some serious ethical and moral issues involved in transplantation, like any new technology that comes along here. Now, there's a whole host of these. We can't get into every one of them in the brief talk we're going to have. I'm going to talk basically about three things. First of all, I want to talk about the general moral question of, is donation even morally acceptable? Then I want to get into the supply issue and deal with two questions there. First of all, where do we obtain our organs from, and how can we increase the supply of organs that are out there? And second of all, how do we distribute fairly the limited supply of organs that we have? First, though, let's talk about the general moral question of transplantation. Is organ donation really morally permissible, morally allowable? You might be surprised to find out that initially, when transplantation first started to occur in the 1950s and 60s, the Christian church actually had a negative reaction against it. They didn't want it. This comes from a strong tradition within Christianity that believes that the body is a sacred part of man as well as his soul. And just because the soul has left the body doesn't mean the body is less sacred. And therefore, the idea of vivisection, or the idea of mutilation of the body, has always been, for Christians, prohibited. And it was seen that transplantation was kind of a form of that. Other philosophers and ethicists had a problem with transplantation in the beginning because they felt like there was an implied dualism that was behind transplantation, that the soul was the only thing that was important, the body wasn't important at all, and what happened to that at death just wasn't an issue. The body was seen as kind of spare parts, or some people even called this a noble form of cannibalism. These are people living off the flesh of other people. So initially, there was a negative backlash to transplantation. We don't see that anymore today. For the most part, people recognize that transplantation is a good thing, okay? The view of it has been replaced with transplantation as a gift, viewing it as a gift there. Many people suffer from terrible debilitations of diseases, and the idea of organ replacement offers a cure, a treatment at least, for many of those people suffering, and have added years for many, many people to live there. The idea of donation emphasizes this idea of gift. And certainly in Christian charity, we can see the idea of offering this gift to help other people is a great and noble thing that we should be involved with. And that's the general view of transplantation today. But it leads kind of to a second question, which is, are we ever ethically obligated to do transplantation or to donate our organs? Well, the idea of gift has been the dominant view of transplantation, and that's where most ethicists are today and want to see it remain, that we see it as a gift and not as an obligation. No one should ever be forced to donate an organ or to donate anything to a person like that. Some people may feel obligations. For example, sometimes parents feel an obligation to donate for their children, or siblings feel an obligation to donate for another person. But generally, we don't view it that way. We view transplantation as what we call a supererogatory act. A supererogatory act is an act that's a good moral act. It's morally permissible. It's an ideal act, but it's not obligatory. In other words, we often use the phrase, it's above and beyond the call of duty. And certainly we can view transplantation that particular way. And in 1968, the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, the AGA, was formed by the federal government to allow people to be able to transplant their organs, donate their organs to other people. Now, of course, there's a limit to this. Okay, morally, it would be inappropriate, it's seen as inappropriate for a person to donate an organ that might cause their death. For example, a living person to donate their heart to another person. We generally view that as morally inappropriate, even though some people might see it as self-sacrifice. The problem with the lack of guarantee that the organ transplantation will actually be successful usually warrants that we shouldn't be doing these kinds of actions here. There are a small minority of people that believe that maybe we should obligate people to donate their organs to one another. Some people are in support of the idea of the government coming in, and after a person dies, they take possession of the body and they allow the organs to be distributed for transplantation issues as a way of dealing with the supply problem. Okay, but most people very much are against that idea there. It's an unwarranted intrusion upon our autonomy to decide how to dispose of our bodies at death. And of course, it destroys the whole idea of the body, the gift being a donation. But that does introduce us to probably the biggest problem in transplantation. And that problem is the problem of scarce resources. We simply don't have enough organs to meet the demands that are out there today. Many, many people are dying, waiting for particular organs here. There's two related problems to this idea of scarce problems. The first one is, how do we morally obtain more organs to be able to take up the lack of supply there? And the second is, how do we go about distributing those organs those limited supply of organs that we do have here? Well, let's talk for a second about obtaining organs here. The hope was in 1968, when the UAGA was passed, that would increase organ donation in our country. Most Americans are actually in favor of organ donation. A large percentage of them are. But what's amazing is that very, very few Americans actually donate their organs or actually plan to donate their organs after their death here. Okay? So suggestions have been made to try to increase the supply of organs. What are some of these? Well, one suggestion that was made was that maybe we should have something called presumed consent. Presumed consent basically says that rather than getting the consent of a patient to get an organ donation, we presume that they consent to it unless they specifically say they don't want to do an organ donation. We just presume consent on them. A lot of people have a problem with this. It's just simply too presumptuous, and it just places an overly burdensome ability for a person to have to think through everything that they would not consent to be able to state that I wouldn't consent to that. So that's never really been very popular. Alternatives, though, that have been more popular is the idea of required request. Many states now require that hospitals specifically request people for organ donations upon admission into their hospitals. They give them information about that, and they request them to make a decision concerning that. The person can always, of course, refuse. They don't have to donate, but the hospital is required to at least ask. Another idea that has been implemented is the idea of required response. Here, the government basically steps in official documents and requires a person to respond to the question about organ donation. Perhaps you've seen something like this on a driver's license. It's very common. Driver's licenses for you to respond whether or not you would want to donate your organs upon your death. Okay, those were seen as possible ways to increase organ supply. Many of them have been around for many years, but unfortunately, we still have seen very little advancing as far as the number of organs that are out there. So some people suggest more drastic measures. Now, part of these have to do with the idea of determining when a person is dead. When a person starts to go into the dying process, organ deterioration begins at a very, very quick rate. So oftentimes, a person after they've actually died, reached whole brain death, their organs have deteriorated to such a state that they were useless for transplantation. So some have suggested obtaining organs earlier in the dying process. Okay? Matter of fact, this really was the major motivation behind the new criteria, the whole brain death criteria that occurred around the late 1960s, when we moved from the traditional idea of death being the failure of heart and lungs to the new idea of death as being the whole brain dying. Okay? One of the main motives for that was so that we could keep a person's heart and lungs pumping when they're whole brain death and keep their organs going so that we could use them for transplantation. Some, though, have argued, well, maybe we can even push that back a little further. For example, some have suggested that if we adopt the new criteria of neocortical death, where the higher brain has died, but the lower brainstem is still functioning, well, then the brainstem would keep the organs going by pumping the blood and by keeping the breathing going, even though the higher brain is dead, and we would have good harvestable organs to be able to use for transplants. And so some have suggested maybe we can have that criteria of death, and that will allow us to increase the supply of organs that we need for organ transplantations. Okay? Others have suggested the use of anencephalic children that are born without a brain at all, but a brain stem. them. These children are born alive, though they'll die in a few hours. And while they're alive, again, some have suggested that maybe we can harvest their organs for brain transplants. Another example of a transplantation issue is the idea of taking patients that are dying, they're not brain dead yet, but they're dying, asking them to sign a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, okay? And then once they are going to the very last process of the dying, we wheel them into a surgical room, we wait till the heart stops beating, we don't try to resuscitate the person, we just immediately harvest the organs right after that, okay? A lot of people think these are awfully gruesome ways. They're hastening death a little bit too fast here, some of them. Maybe the person's not really dead with the neocortical death there, you know? We're moving too quickly to try to get some good, try to get some organs, and yet at the same time, you know, we're really pushing the death limits too far here. It's awfully gruesome to imagine a bunch of doctors standing over a patient just waiting for him to die so they can immediately cut open the body and take away their organs. So there's some real moral problems with some of these suggestions. Another suggestion has been the idea of selling organs, okay? The argument is, of course, that people who donate their organs should get something from them. They're donating the raw resource here, so maybe they should get some financial incentive there. This has never been real popular, and it's got all sorts of problems with it. Of course, it could be so easily abused. Poor people end up suffering. People who are rich are the only ones that can afford the organ, and so we really have tried to avoid the idea of selling organs there. We need to be leery of these ideas, these new ideas that are trying to replace organs. This is still an issue we're working on. We're still trying to increase our supply. Many people believe the best way to do this is still to continue to appeal to people to donate their organs at a proper time. Finally, the last ethical issue I want to talk about has to do with distributing organs that we have here. We recognize, of course, that we have a very limited supply of organs that are out there, very limited. Therefore, we have to decide who gets the organ and who doesn't get the organ. That's really, in many cases, a life and death decision. Okay? Some people will live, they'll get organs or transplants, but a lot of people won't. How do you decide who gets it and who doesn't get it? There's two general views concerning this idea, what's called the egalitarian view and the utilitarian view. The egalitarian view basically says that everyone is equal, all people are equal, and therefore we should distribute them as equally as we possibly can. Now, how do we go about doing that? Well, the most common way we think of is some sort of random way of selecting people. Something like a lottery, for example, or flipping a coin, for example, would be a random way. The most common random way is suggested, and it's implemented today, is the first come, first served method. Who's ever there first, who gets on the list first, who's at the top of the organ donation list, they're the ones that are eligible for the organ. That's the egalitarian method. The utilitarian method basically wants to argue that social utility is the standard that we should use for organ donations. We look at individuals and we look at specific qualifications of individuals, and we say which of these individuals has the best qualification, or how will society best benefit from these particular individuals, and we make our donation decision based upon that. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have two persons that are in need of a heart transplant. One is a homeless man, and the other one is a world-renowned surgeon. Both of them are compatible. Both of them would benefit from the heart transplant, so all things are being equal here. Now we're just looking at the two individuals. How would these two views handle these? Well, the egalitarian would say, look, these are both equal persons. They both have an equal need here. Therefore, the only fair way to distribute the organ between them is to flip a coin. Okay, heads, the homeless man gets it. Tails, the world-renowned surgeon gets it. And we just leave it to chance. We just leave it to fate, or we leave it to God in that particular case. Okay. Utilitarian would sit there and say, well, now wait a second, okay? The world-renowned surgeon, society is going to benefit greatly from this man. This man deserves to live longer. I mean, he's going to do great surgeries. He's going to help a lot of people. Many people will benefit from his life. Who's going to benefit from the homeless man? As a matter of fact, the homeless man is even a detriment on our society. We all have to now, help him. We have to provide for him. He's not contributing to society at all. And so the social utilitarian says, look, we need to consider the idea of a qualifications for a person. Not everybody's qualified necessarily for the heart here. Well, currently, the way that organs are distributed right now is the egalitarian method. UNOS, which is the United Network for Organ Sharing, is the one that determines who gets all the organs in our country here. They have regional centers set up through the United States. And this is determined regionally, and it's basically a first-come, first-served basis. There are some limiting factors that they eliminate certain people from the list and such, but for the most part, it's pretty much first-come, first-served. And that's generally how organs are being handled in our country. However, critics of UNOS say there are certain problems with it. First of all, it can be easily abused. For example, Steve Jobs, the famous founder of Apple Incorporated, he was able to get on multiple lists because he had the money. You have to pay to get on these lists. So he had the money to be able to get on multiple regional lists. and he's got a private plane. He could fly anywhere he wants in the country at a moment's notice. So for him, he could be on these lists and be able to get these organs where many people simply can't afford that. So it seems to favor the rich, many people say. Another problem that people say is that we should take lifestyle considerations into account. Should a person, for example, an alcoholic who's been an alcoholic all his life and now has cirrhosis of the liver and needs a new liver transplant, should he really be put on the same level as the person who's taken care of himself and been healthy? He just happens to have some sort of liver cancer and he needs a liver transplant. Many people want those lifestyle considerations to be taken place. However, the egalitarians come back and say, yeah, but if we're going to start coming up with qualifications, then the big question is, who's going to determine those? Who's going to be the person that determines the criteria that should be allowed for when a person can or cannot get a transplantation? Somebody's going to have to make those decisions. And what criteria are they going to use? And it's something that we're all going to agree with. Right now, the general view that's taken, and I think it's the correct view, the general view that's taken right now is that the egalitarian method is probably the best method to go with. It's not perfect. There isn't a perfect method to handle this. It's a very difficult problem to deal with. But generally, we feel like it's better to err on the side of treating all people as if they're equal and they all have an equal access to life. Life is an important attribute that we think all people should have, and therefore to sit there and say, well, this person has to die because for some reason criteria they don't have the lifestyle that we want, just seems to be unfair. Well, those are just some issues that are involved in organ transplantation. There's many, many other issues. We just scratched the surface of some of these things. I challenge you to go on and do some more work in some other areas and look into some other books, and I hope you do good on doing that. Thank you for being with us today.